So today we got the privilege of hearing from our very own department head, Dr. Stephen Yaninek, and I'll give a little bit of background for him for those of you who don't know. He got his degrees, all 3 degrees, bachelor's, master's, and PhD from UC Berkeley. It wasn't until his PhD degree that he focused particularly in entomology. After graduating, he went on an exchange program in the 70s, and that was to East Africa. And this exchange program really changed his life. He worked with the crop management and helping the natives there with developing that way. After that, he moved back to the United States into the USDA, which is the section which is now known as NIFA, and also worked in the International Institute of Tropical and Agriculture in West Africa. That was before he came back. And so he spent a lot of time in Africa, and his time in Africa really changed his life and gave him the kind of focus of working with biocontrol and also international development. And then in 2000, he moved here to Purdue, and here he is today. So today he'll be speaking to us more about the history of the Department of Entomology here at Purdue.
Thank you, Gabe. He's going to be a great extension agent because at least 50% of what he said was true. Okay, so I appreciate that. It's a privilege to be here, and I'd like to first recognize all of our new students. Who are our new students? Undergraduate and graduate. Raise your hands that are in the room today. Okay, welcome. Pleasure to meet you. New staff and faculty that are here. Raise your hands. Okay, welcome. Great to see you here. What I'm going to do today is try to set the tone for the Centennial Year. We're celebrating 100 years as a Department of Entomology, but as you'll see, as I go through my presentation, entomology has been a much bigger part of Purdue for a much longer time than just 100 years. And we have a whole series of lectures that have been set up for this year, many of them featuring faculty and staff from our department. So this is going to be a wonderful opportunity for us to hear about what's going on right now in entomology. The past gives us a little bit of a sense of where we are today. So I'm not going to be able to cover all the details that would be encapsulated in a 100-year period, but I'm going to try to give you just a sense of where we are. This is our centennial year, but we're not the only ones celebrating a centennial, as I discovered when I went online. The cherry blossom trees around the tidal basin in Washington, D.C. came from Tokyo in 1912. By the way, most of them died within the first few decades, and they've been replaced since. But also the Girl Scouts and Oreo cookies are celebrating a centennial, as are the states of New Mexico and Arizona, both 100 years old this year. And for the sports fans, well, not sports fans, but for those that like historical events, the Titanic sunk 100 years ago, and for the sports fans, Fenway Park was built 100 years ago. So today, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about Purdue University and where entomology has hit the calendar since the beginning. So starting with 1869, I'm going to give you the big picture, and really most of my emphasis is going to be on the early years, because when we get to the more recent times, I'm going to leave those details up to you, especially those of you that are going to be making presentations later in the semester. Okay, so I'm not going to be data heavy, but these first couple slides are, just to let you know that we have this information if you're curious about the history of the department. We've hired 92 faculty since we started, and 69 of them have left. So there's a net 23 faculty in the department. That's what we have today. And if you look at it over time, the numbers were pretty sparse in the early days, and it wasn't until really after World War II that the numbers increased. And the establishment we have today was more or less set in the 50s. Our alums, likewise, as a service department, we had very few specific entomology alums in the early days. Even before our first degrees, we had a curriculum in 1928. We had some students that were getting degrees specializing in entomology, but their degrees were in natural history and or special topics. So there were a few bachelor's and master's degrees that were granted before 1928. But today we've got over 1,000 degrees and over 900 alums that have graduated from entomology. And that's that very poor picture is the Thomas A. Entomological Society in 1939. There have only been 4 department heads in entomology. In fact, the first 4, there have been 6 department heads, the first 4 spanned over 100 years. And the first 2 by themselves covered over 70 years. But there's been quite a bit of leadership in our discipline coming from our department. J.J. Davis was the only person, I believe, who was both president of the Entomological Society of America and the American Association of Economic Entomologists before those societies merged in 1953. And then you'll see in the 90s, there was some kind of mafia going on here because three of the presidents came from Purdue. And then there's a whole host of details about courses and textbooks and so forth that I'm just not going to have time to go into. But those, we're putting as much of this information on our Centennial website if you're curious and interested. There is going to be a scroll that goes across the screen quickly of highlights about the department. This is also available, and I'm looking for any corrections that I can get from you. But it's not meant to be something that you read right now, but some of these facts are going to be picked up during the course of the presentation, and others will just be provided as part of our history looking back. Actually, the basis for this came when I got a hold of a document that had been prepared by Eldon and faculty in the 1970s, and this was in preparation for the bicentennial of the United States. And so I've added considerably to that, but you can see I just ran out of energy at 2006. Not that we ran out of highlights, I just haven't gotten beyond that. Okay, so our history spans pretty much the entire history of Purdue. And if we look at Purdue, you know, it got started when the Morrill Act was passed in 1862, and then the legislature decided that they wanted to participate in this, and Purdue University got established in 1869. Our benefactor and namesake, John Purdue, put up some money and put up some land and did some hard negotiating and got the university named after him. And this is probably what the campus looked like in about the mid-1800s. Mid-1880s, I should say. It still looked pretty much like a very rural area, and a lot of the agricultural research animals and crops were grown just on campus, so they didn't have far to go. The very first students didn't come to Purdue until 1874. But the first ag students didn't get here until 1879, which has always been a bit of a curiosity to me because we're a land-grant university. And why did it take an additional 5 years for the ag students to find their way to Purdue? I don't know the answer to that. Well, that year, that fall, entomology was taught in the spring, so it wasn't until 1880 that the very first short course on economic entomology was taught. And it probably was taught by 1880. It could have been even one of the university presidents, because there were very few faculty in the entire university at that point. Well, the School of Agriculture got established in 1884, and it was at that time they created the Department of Horticulture and Entomology. And so the very first entomologist that was on campus was this guy here. This was F.M. Webster, who was appointed by USDA to come to Purdue and be associated with the then new experiment station. And so he's identified as the first professional entomologist in Indiana. Troop, who came as a general agriculturalist, taught entomology, but he taught a lot of other things as well. So Troop came in 1884 and was hired as the head of the Joint Department of Horticulture and Entomology. And Webster published the very first publication of the experiment station. It was in December of 1884, and it was on Hessian fly. Okay, so the very first publication of this experiment station is an entomological publication. He was here until 1891 before he went back to Washington, where he set up a new cereals division of forage insects, and he was the chief of that division. And it was in that capacity that he decided to establish one of the very first field stations around the country here in Indiana. It was set up in Richmond, Indiana in 1905. And that becomes important to us later on because J.J. Davis, who's the next department head, gets his start in Indiana as a USDA employee. Now, Troop came to us from Michigan State. He was born in New York and then got a bachelor's and master's at Michigan State. And he did some graduate work at Cornell and Harvard. But when he got here, he was pretty much relegated to teaching because he taught everything that needed to be taught, that could be taught. He taught horticulture, entomology, agricultural, botany, forestry, and even veterinary sciences. And evidently he did a very good job. This is what the first curriculum looked like for ag students in 1884. You can see freshmen, sophomore, juniors, seniors, and they shifted entomology from first-year students to third-year students from 1880 to 1884. So it wasn't until the first term of the third year that the students took a 12-week course in entomology, and it was always economic entomology at that point. So in the teens, we had Troop became the first state entomologist. There was this outbreak of San Jose scale that came into the United States and California, reached Indiana probably in the 1870s, and by the 1890s they decided they needed to put some money into it. So the legislature decided they needed a state entomologist. So basically they hired Troop on a per diem basis, and he was given an additional $2.50 plus expenses for each day that he worked as a state entomologist. Well, that lasted until 1807, so I don't know if it's because he didn't do his job or he couldn't do the job or didn't want to do the job, but then there was a separate division of entomology set up in the legislature, and there was another individual outside of Purdue that became the state entomologist, and that continues today, in fact. Phil Marshall is the current state entomologist in Indiana. And I confirmed that, Tom. When Bob Waltz stepped down, he carried the title of state entomologist to the state chemist office for about a year. And then there were some maneuvers made to get it put back to the DNR. So I talked about him being a teacher par excellence and being the first state entomologist. He was also there when the Board of Trustees decided it was time to split this group up. These are the actual minutes from the Board of Trustees, and you can't see the date there, but it says, my computer, it's 1911. And what they say is that because of the growth of the interest and importance of these subjects, it seems advisable to give each large attention. And they decide to split. And they also decide that Troop is going to go with entomology, and that this Professor Chase G. Woodward would be appointed the head of horticulture. Now, in some notes that I got from the Thomas A. Entomological Society, they said that when Troop became head of the department, he had no funds, and it was the son of the dean that became the head of horticulture with all the funds. What an interesting and unusual incident. Now, I don't know if that's true, because the actual dean of agriculture at that time was Skinner. So I don't know if there's some misunderstanding or that this guy was a son of a dean of something else. But anyway, there's always been that perception that entomology has been getting the short end of the stick on some of these things. And that goes back right to the beginning. So it's still a very small department. It was service-oriented. There were 3 faculty. 1 course eventually expanded to 5. And during that period, when Troop was part of the department, they started to have students get degrees, even though we didn't have an official curriculum until 1928. Now, important to note that in those early days, agriculture had a separate department of extension, but it didn't include entomology. If you look at that very first report they did in 1912, they give the lineup of the staff. And they have a superintendent, a soils and crops person, exhibits and short courses, Farmers Institute, home ec, seed analyst, animal husbandry, not beekeeping like I thought, it's bookkeeping, okay, and then a clerk. So there was a need for extension entomology, so what was being done is that they were basically getting sort of free extension help from the entomologists that were hired, and that was something that persisted even when JJ got hired until we hired our first extension specialist in 1936. So if we look at what happened during that period, during the teens, a couple more staff were hired. It was still very much a rural campus. You can see they're out there spraying in the orchard with their horse-drawn spray rigs. This is the experiment station where our faculty resided. And they were there until they built the new experiment station, which is what is today Ag Hall. Okay? And about the same time they were building the new experiment station, a few years later they built what is today Findler Hall. Findler Hall previously had been Entomology Hall. Prior to that, it was Ag Hall. So entomology was split in those two buildings in the early days. We'll talk more about that in a minute. J.J. Davis joined us in 1920 after a reasonably long stint with USDA. He'd come out of Centralia, Illinois. Gotten his bachelor's degree at the University of Illinois, worked for Illinois Natural History Survey for a short time before he joined USDA in Richmond, Indiana. And then he became head of the station in, I think, 1911. And then they moved the station to West Lafayette. And he stayed with them until 1919 when he got transferred to New Jersey to work on the then new Japanese beetle. He was there a short time because he had the offer to come back to Purdue as department head. So he came here and he decided to live here. He liked it here, didn't want to leave. Stayed for a long time. Incredibly prolific individual, over 200 publications. He also was a tremendous corresponder. He loved getting his mail. He would hover over the secretary's office around 10 or 10:30 every morning waiting for that mail to come in, and then he would disappear for the rest of the day until he would read the mail and answer all of his correspondence. He corresponded with everybody. He answered every question that came into the department about insects. He maintained correspondence with stakeholders when alums were sent overseas during World War II. He'd created a newsletter that he wrote about every 2 months, letting everybody know what was going on in the department at Purdue and what each was happening to each other. So he'd give news about all the alums that were scattered all over the world. This guy must have never done anything but write, because he was always doing something like that. But he was really very well known for his accomplishments as a teacher, as a researcher, and as an extension agent, and eventually became a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the 50s. He was also known as the chief. Apparently he liked that title. Some called him Old Ironsides, and the pest control industry called him Professor Pest Control. This is really unusual. This is a picture of JJ when he's 5 years old with his braids. This is in 1890. This is JJ in high school. When he graduated as a senior in high school, he had the opportunity to participate in senior night, and he read an essay that he wrote about the land-grant university. In 1900 or 1901, I think it was 1900, at the age of 15, he had an exhibit in the State Fair in Illinois, and he won first prize for it. And we have the ribbon that he received in our archives. So that's kind of cool. He lived for a long time right here on Waldron Street. Tom says the house is still there. It's just down here near the stadium.
Just down from Cary.
From Cary Hall. And he used to, when he wasn't working on his correspondence, he used to have students over to his house all the time. These are all obviously pictures taken towards the end of his career. One of the things that strikes me, if you look at this picture, who does he look like? Anybody have a guess? I think he looks a lot like Stephen Colbert. It's remarkable. I'm sure the personalities aren't anything alike. During his time, he was able to start adding faculty. And oh, by the way, I guess I should add that Tom and I have figured out that he was married at least 4 times to at least 3 women. Had no children of his own. So really following up his legacy has been very difficult. He had, there was an adopted child and 2 stepchildren. And the stepchildren today would be in their 90s if they were alive. So that link, we don't have a connection to his family anymore. What's interesting here, when JJ first got here, he had a little bit of trouble keeping people. 6 out of the first 7 hires left after a short time. And I don't know if it's because he was a difficult boss or times were good and they had better opportunities. But then as the time got closer to the Depression, some of those folks came and stayed for a long period of time. For example, Howard Day, hired in 1929, was there until 1964, stayed for 35 years. And B.E. Montgomery stayed until 1968 for 39 years. Okay, and then the next year, 1930, they hired George Edward Eddy Marshall, who was there from 1930 to 1963. So during this period, we were able to establish a major. And then there was a second major. And when I say period, now we're talking about the 20s through the 50s. Those are the J.J. Davis years. And then the courses, number of courses expanded to 31. And it started to create a culture of outstanding teachers. And people like Howard Day was part of that culture. And subsequent teachers, Leland Chandler was an outstanding teacher, Bill Fishhang. And it carries forward. And we'll talk about some of those other outstanding teachers in a minute. Montgomery was an expert on odonates and bumblebees, but I understand there are more stories about B.E. Montgomery than probably any other single faculty member in the department, and I don't have very many of them. So one of them is a story about then President Hovde was taking a group of visitors, including a very wealthy benefactor, on a tour of the campus. And they were down here by Horticulture, by where the vet school is, looking at some flower gardens. Well, Montgomery also had his beehives down there, but apparently some of the students had mowed the lawn around the beehives and they were not very happy. And this was on a weekend when the president brought this entourage, and most of them got stung. And on Monday morning the following week, Monty, as they call him, got a phone call saying, "Those beehives will be moved post-haste." And Monty agreed. I mean, couldn't say no. And so over the course of the next 3 or 4 days, the bees that had been out foraging because it was warm and couldn't come back proceeded to continue stinging anybody they could find in that area. So Monty had a chance to even further enlighten the president about bee biology because he got called a second time about why are they still stinging those people. In the 40s, the pest control industry coughed up and bought this suit of armor, which we used as a prop in teaching the value of external exoskeleton. And that's not a very good picture of the gifts being given to us, but the armor got stolen from a storage room in 1981. And Tom thinks he knows where it is. Probably fraternity prank, and it's just been a big mystery. Anyway, during that time, from 1920 to 1950, the faculty expanded considerably from 3 to 12. In fact, the very first sabbatical ever was taken by Montgomery. He went to New Zealand to study bumblebees in 1949. And I think, I can't remember who it was, said that he probably didn't know a damn thing about bumblebees until he took the sabbatical and then became an expert after he was over there. If you talk to some of the students that had JJ as a teacher during that period, they had really fond memories of his style. One of the things that John Favinger, who got his bachelor's degree in 1940, remembers, then he became state entomologist in 1959 and stayed state entomologist until 1984, were some of the limericks that he used to have in class. He said they were often very, very easy to remember, but not necessarily very, very accurate. But he really enjoyed the levity that JJ would bring into his class. So he could recite some of these limericks himself even after 40 years. And he says, here's to the happy bounding flea. You cannot tell the he from she. The sexes are the same, you see. But she can tell, and so can he. And JJ used to do this all the time. And in fact, he was such a prolific joke collector and teller. The pest control industry actually helped him publish a compilation of his jokes, which we have a copy of in case you're interested. If you're interested in seeing it, we don't have a lot of extra copies per se. So in the 30s, there wasn't much going on. It was the Depression. And I talked about, well, Marshall was hired. Marshall was the one faculty member who spent his entire career off station. He was first at Bedford, and then he went to Mitchell, Indiana, and spent his entire time there. He was very independent as a consequence. And his work was on residue chemistry and residue impacts on vegetables. And people used to ask him, what's the best way to tell when it's time to, when you can eat the fruits or vegetables? And he would say, when the aphid numbers start to build up. So he would use the insects as his measure of doing that. He also had this a passion about getting under the skin of JJ. Every year at the beginning of the year, he would send him a letter and let him know. It was his annual gripe letter about all the things he didn't like about the way things were going. And occasionally he used to ship JJ a crate of apples and send them cash on delivery so that he would receive these apples and it would cost a lot more to pay for than they were actually worth. So it's a hint for anybody trying to get in the good graces of the department head, I suppose. He wasn't the only one. Shooter used to get bored at meetings and he'd pull out his fingernail clipper and clip his fingernails and file them down. And that was kind of a sign that the meeting was going on too long. So faculty have their ways of, pardon?
He did it at every meeting.
Okay. He probably had the best looking nails in the college. If you look at the research at that time, a lot of it was driven by the insects and the opportunities that those insects brought with them. Of course, the work on Hessian fly, white bugs, white grubs and chinch bugs, codling moth, honeybees. European corn borer was a big new pest in the 20s. In fact, it brought money to the department. They were able to get some facilities built and actually got new faculty positions as a consequence of that. It worked on Japanese beetles, pollinators, leaf hoppers, spittlebugs, sweet clover wheels. And a lot of the money from the legislature was used to build facilities. And the cultures were starting to change. FDA was getting involved. They were starting to become concerned about residues and other impacts on consumers. So work that we were doing on host plant resistance, or cultural control, and biological control evolved to include work on looking at chemistries, chemical efficiencies, residue analysis, spray technology. And it was also during that time that Howard Day and an engineer from ag engineering start working on electricity and radiant energy. We're going to hear more about that later from, what's your friend's name?
John Barrett.
John Barrett worked with, I guess it was Taylor that worked with Howard Day at the time. It's really important to know that this very basic work that was done at the time helped establish what the wavelengths were that were important for attracting insects. And that became instrumental in the kinds of light bulbs that were later developed that would not attract insects, and became also the basis for many of the light traps that are used today by entomologists around the world. So I think that's a sort of piece of trivia that I didn't really know much about. Probably the seminal work that they did was published in 1960. On that, and they worked for about 30 years. During that period, everybody did extension until we hired our first full-time specialist, which was Glenn Laker. Beekeeping was a big concern, and there was important influence that the beekeepers could put on the legislature. And also, we developed a very special partnership with the pest control industry. It was a time when JJ was always looking for things to do. He invited himself to a conference, a pest control conference in 1935. He said, we can do some things to make this better. So the industry said, if you guys put on a training course for us, we'll send some technicians. So in 1937, they had a 5-day conference. They had 68 pest control operators from 14 states, and it grew from there. And that's the conference that we still host today. The 76th conference was just done in 2012, and we'll be hosting the 77th this coming January. It's that conference that then gave us the basis for the big urban pest management group we have in place today. And we'll talk more about some of those things in a minute. So in 1940s, during World War II, there was a single hire, but then it was right after the war that the faculty started to expand. George Gould had already been on the faculty since 1931, but it was during this period he got his PhD. And I have his PhD thesis right here. It's not this big one. It's the small one in front of it. So that's the first PhD thesis that was done in this department, 1942. These are JJ's memories, as he calls them. Okay. Now, it's interesting, Gould was best known for his very important work he did on cockroaches, although he was hired to work on fruit pests. In fact, his dissertation, vegetable pests, is on striped cucumber beetle. But the experiment station at that time says, no way, no how are you going to be working on urban pests. It's not a production ag problem, no resources for you, no facilities for you. If you're going to do this, it's going to be done outside of hours, weekends, and so forth. And that's what he did. And in fact, I guess he worked on 6 species of cockroaches, and the cockroach people can clarify this and let me know about this, but evidently this is some of the most important foundational work for cockroach biology that exists. Now you're going to have to go check, right? Outreach was a big interest of JJ's, and he was one of the very first to start to span this effort from taking an extension effort and making it part of the outreach effort. So he was instrumental in getting a collecting and identification program set up in the 20s, which he handed on to Glenn Laker, who did it even better and got national recognition for those efforts. We talked about, and this is some of the photographs from the day where kids got involved and got interested. And in fact, in our new freshman class, about 30% of them are here because they got their start as 4-H entomology students. But JJ was a very big collector of all kinds of art, or cartoons that had insects in it. And wherever he could get the original, he would write to the artist and say, it would be great if we could have this as part of our collection. And he doesn't have a huge amount, but he's got some of, for example, this Chick Young strip, we have the original. Okay, it's part of our collection, and we're going to have these pieces on display this coming spring over there in Stewart Gallery as part of our Centennial celebration. Now, in the 1950s, this was a period of tremendous growth. World War II was over. All these GIs were coming back. Federal government had money again. They started investing. Universities were growing like crazy. And it was also a period of growth and application of pesticides. Pesticides were going to solve all the problems of the world. And it was a chance for our faculty to expand. Now, prudently, John Osmond added basic science to the portfolio of this department. So we weren't just doing applied research, we started doing more basic science as well. And when John became department head, he was able to bring the USDA and the U.S. Department of Interior faculty over as adjuncts. He actually brought the USDA agriculture people into the department in '56 because they were over in an old post office in Lafayette up to that point. And we're going to talk about space in a second. But there's Eel and its pristine days, and it was part of the expansion that was occurring right after World War II. Glenn Laker with a 4-H winner. I'm going to talk a bit later about Bill Brim and George Gilmore's undergraduate project that became a company. And this is an image taken of Howard Day with Taylor doing some work on lights in a cornfield. Glenn Laker was famous for his Chalk Talk presentations, and we have one of his Chalk Talk presentations in video form, in case you're interested. Well, John Osmond became department head in 1956. When John came, he came from industry. He was working at Merck Chemicals and got convinced to come join Purdue in 1948. Now, John had a master's degree, a bachelor's and master's degree from Massachusetts State University. It then became University of Massachusetts after that. But he joined the department, and he did research, extension, and teaching, and he was department head from 1956 to 1972. And then he got a chance to go to Washington and establish the pesticide applicator training program and set the national standards, which he did. And then came back to Indiana and introduced the program to Indiana, and he headed that program until he retired in 1987. Here's JJ handing the keys to the department over to John. Now, what's interesting, John was doing his PhD in Illinois that spring. So he was a graduate student when he gets a call saying, "Oh, do you want to be department head?" And very unusual. So he became department head right out of graduate school. Tremendous growth in number of faculty during this period. We added 5 new faculty. You can see that, and that's when the USDA people became adjunct faculty as well. Of this group, Osmond is the only faculty member today that's alive. Anybody hired from this time forward, he's the only one. So the next one is Bill Fishhang, who was hired in 1960. Okay. So he's the last link to a group of faculty in history that we have. That's important, and we're still communicating with John on a regular basis, and even this week we've had some contact, and his health is still frail, but he's still very alert. Some of the faculty that were at this time: Dobson, Dave Matthew was a second extension person hired, and you couldn't have 2 individuals more different in style and function between Dave and Glenn. Glenn was fastidious, neat. His desk was always cleared. He was proper. Dave was disorganized, completely unprepared. He was easy to take advantage of, but he was endearing to his audience, and he was always willing to go as far as it needed to go in the state to meet the demands and needs of the stakeholders. So between the 2 of them, they complemented each other very well, because Glenn would take care of the sort of administrative details back home, and Dave was most happy when he was looking for Dairy Queen somewhere spread around the state, because he knew where all of them were. This is some interesting information I found. I was going through the Board of Trustees notes and found that we had a faculty member that had died in 1953. Now, this was a young man. I didn't know why he died. I'd just been hired in 1946. And they said that he had died from some kind of self-administered poisoning. And that was all it said. So I went to the Journal and Courier, and this was the evening paper of April 14th, 1953. And Philip Berg was found at the base of what was then called the Bypass Bridge, over 52 Bridge, crossing over the Wabash. And he was found, it was in the morning, he was still alive when they found him. Evidently, he had ingested potassium cyanide crystals. And he was dead within 15 minutes. I never knew anything about this. No one had ever mentioned it to me. You can't find this in sort of the established history of the department. And still don't know why, what prompted him to commit suicide. But this is some of the surprises you find when you start to look back in the history of the department. And this was the faculty when Osmond took over. And it's amazing how many of these faculty members actually have Purdue pedigrees. Like, well, that's JJ, and that's Montgomery. Montgomery at least had, was it 1 degree or 2 degrees? Montgomery had a master's degree from Purdue, and that's Howard Day, and that's Ortman. Shooter had all of his degrees from Purdue. Gould had his PhD. John got his PhD, but not at Purdue while he was here. Marshall had no degrees from Purdue, but Laker had both bachelor's and master's degree from Purdue. And then we have Everly, Cleveland. Chandler had his master's degree from Purdue, and that's Wilson.
Is that Kurt on the end?
Yeah, that was Kurt. That's Kurt on the end right there. Well, during the 60s, it was the period of perils of pesticides, and it was a time when cereal leaf beetle became a huge crisis, not only in the state but in the region. And our research started to look at the widespread use of pesticides and look at residues, toxicology, physiology, and biochemistry. And other areas included forest pest management, biocontrol, particularly using pathogens, ecology, nematode systematics, hessian fly, host plant resistance, and so forth. We also added computer technology became a new addition to the department. Now, Ron Giese had been hired in the late 50s to be a forest entomologist, but in the 60s he became much more interested in pest management and finding ways to quantify pest concerns. And what's really interesting to note is that Pedigo was a Giese advisee. May not have been his major professor, but he was on his committee. And Larry moved from Purdue in 1969 to Iowa, and then he wrote sort of the seminal textbook on pest management that became kind of the Bible for the pest management that was done for the next couple of decades. So maybe the IPM we're practicing today had its roots in forest pest management and Ron Giese. Also, he was real peculiar. He was a guy that came from out of state, and he was concerned about this being a hot, warm climate and that there being snakes around. And Chandler, being a native from the Hoosier, he just would tease him about it because he insisted on traveling with a snake bite kit. So one day he was out in the Jasper area doing some work on, it was a Columbia timber beetle, and they were having lunch, him and a graduate student sitting on a log, and in between them a copperhead snake jumped up over the log, and they dispatched the snake, put it in a jar of alcohol, brought it back to campus, and he shoved it into Chandler's face because Chandler was the one giving him a hard time. He said, "Look, see this? Look at this, you SOB. No poisonous snakes, my ass." So he felt vindicated. Anyway, Giese evidently was a very passionate guy. It was also during this period that we started the pest control, the pest correspondence course, and to have material for that, they decided they needed a textbook, and they got Truman to write the scientific guide for the courses. Well, indeed, the correspondence courses continue today. We have about 2,000 people that take the course every year, and the Truman Scientific Guide is now in its 7th edition. Okay, so some of those things continue to go on. Pest survey, still a big part of the department. Pesticide standards were being developed because it actually set the basis for the Huffaker project that was to come in the 80s. I talked about forest pest management becoming kind of the basis for crop pest management. And international development was starting to get some headway. I know that we had Montgomery taking another sabbatical. He went to the Arctic to work on bumblebees up there. We also had Paschke was doing foreign exploration in Europe, and Paschke took a sabbatical leave as well. He went to England in the late 60s. And we actually had one of our faculty who was sent to Pakistan on a attachment with the U.S. Department of State. It was Montgomery. That was Glenn Laker, who was sent to Pakistan on an aid mission, where he spent a year working over there. And some of the pests that started getting some attention, soybean cyst nematodes, of course, cereal leaf beetle and alfalfa weevil were all new to the state. But also interesting is that Ag Hall became Entomology Hall. So what happened? Well, the dean moved out of Ag Hall into the old experiment station, which became the new Ag Hall, and it was a chance to rename Ag Hall Entomology Hall. But prior to that, they had to get rid of sociology, because when John Osmond moved in, all the faculty were consolidated in 1956. They shared what was then Entomology Hall with sociology and the Dean of Agriculture. Well, they discovered one day that one of the classrooms that the sociology department had was pulling away from the wall because of the weight of the insect collection a floor below them. And they condemned that room immediately. And then, of course, they had to move the collection down to the basement. But that got rid of half of sociology in one afternoon. And they used that room subsequently as a flight chamber, and it was the only flight chamber of its kind in the country for quite a while. And then space was so tight. Faculty were 2 or 3 in a office, and everybody shared labs. It wasn't ideal by any means, but it was the best that we could do. And indeed, we made do. So in the 1960s, we continued to add faculty. We added 4 more faculty.
Including 1 female.
That was just my point. The very first hire in the department, female hire in the department, was added, but not the first female in agriculture. There was a female hired in horticulture in the early 40s.
Not a professor.
I don't know.
No, I was the only professor.
Okay. Well, you were the only female professor in agriculture I know at that time.
Long time.
That's right. And in our department, it took until Linda got hired in '91 before we had a second female faculty member.
And nobody wanted her, I might also add.
Linda?
No.
Why?
Wait a minute now. Linda, I'm still talking about number 1.
Anyway, it's really significant. That's not that long ago. I mean, obviously, it's in some of our lifetimes. So.
Well, some of it.
In the 70s, it was the era of IPM, and another change in leadership in our department. Huge growth in the number of faculty and students interested in pest management, and there was also an interest from the state and the feds in getting more regulations set up, and this is where we started getting involved in programs like the National Pesticide Information System, which provide the basis for what is today the Center for Environmental and Regulatory Information Systems. Okay, so something that we have in our department. In terms of the research, continue working on host plant resistance. Dick Shade was working on glandular hairs on forage crops. Wasn't getting a lot of cooperation out of agronomy from the breeders, but Marshall Don. We had aquatic entomology, added McCafferty and Provenza. Had a string of short-term ecologists that came and went and came and went and came and went, working in biocontrol, physiology, immunology. And then we also developed some very practical handbooks, IPM handbooks that were then spread across the country, because those 5-unit series got picked up by over half the land-grant universities, 80 other colleges, and was more or less the standard for short-term courses in IPM. Eldon came on in 1972. He came to us by way of K-State, and then later he was in South Dakota, where he was a director of a USDA lab working on cereal pests. He was department head from '72 until '89, and then in '89 he continued on here at Purdue, but stayed on in administration from 1989 to 2003. If you take a look at Osmond's style and Ortman's style, and this is just speculation based on what I know about the two and what I read in this book about these two individuals, pretty stark contrast. Osmond was a risk taker. He could be more emotional, short-tempered, and the champion of the underdog, okay? And he would only use committees as sort of advisory in nature. He didn't really follow what they recommended, whereas Eldon was more conservative. He'd been brought up in the school of rigid federal regulations, and when he would look at or consider hiring a new faculty member, he would only do it when he had all the resources and space, everything lined up perfectly. He didn't want to have anything left open to chance. He was very, very cool and calm individual, and sort of followed a wait-and-see approach on things. But he would follow the recommendations of his committees. So he did use them purposely. And this was a period where Purdue started to establish our pest management programs, like the Pesticide Applicator Training Program. Al York helped create and then edit the insecticide and acaricide test publication for a number of years. And Symptom Circus, which was the two Don shows. It was Don Schuler from Entomology and Don Scott from plant pathology would put on a show talking about insect and plant pathogen pests in tails and tucks, top hat. And apparently it got so popular they even booked in the Playboy Club in Chicago at one point. Bug Scout got its start, and gypsy moth was just on the horizon, as was the western corn rootworm. And those of you that are not familiar with Bug Scout, it was a cartoon used to help educate our cooperators about pest management practices. The inspiration for this individual actually came from one of our graduate students, John Mumford. And you can see the likeness is pretty remarkable. John was recently honored as one of our distinguished ag alums and as one of our Osmond Award winners as well. He's a professor in England. In the 70s, we had a tremendous growth in the faculty, and we got up to the all-time high in terms of numbers. It was like 26 faculty, and one of the faculty hired was this guy, Andy Gutierrez. Andy came in 1970, and didn't like the good old boy system. He particularly didn't like Kurt Wilson. And 13 months into his time at Purdue, he walked into the main office and says, "I'm giving you 30-day notice. I'm out of here. I have 30 days leave coming," and he left the next day.
Now, that's your version, because he was your major professor.
And if I can continue, 9 years later, he was my major professor. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Well, you're welcome to it.
Anyway. Here's some of our graduate students in 1973. Are they all graduate students? What about that guy?
Oh, look at that.
I think I know who that is.
Oh, I know who that is.
That's a comedian on Comedy Central. I didn't know we had comedians in the group. In the 80s, there was a period of consolidation. The state went into a recession, and there was a contraction in the number of faculty, and it was offset in part by growth in professional staff. And it's not a very good picture, but these are some of the professional staff, some of which are still here today. This is Obermeyer and Pravancha, Bledsoe, and so forth. We needed to continue having some of these program needs met, and so professional staff were a solution. And Ortman actually developed standards for promotion that's now used by the entire college for our professional staff. And we're the only college in the university that has a promotion process for our professional staff. We got involved in developing an interdisciplinary crop protection curriculum. We had a few students, never really went anywhere, and we took that out of circulation a few years ago. But there was a big push to create credit hours because agriculture was considered a school that was undersubscribed in terms of the number of students we were reaching out to across the campus. So we developed some courses, some very popular courses for non-majors, like our insects, friends, and foe class. And then general entomology was taught, and you always want to have your best professors teaching those introductory courses because it's a great way to reach out to students. If you take a look at the research, the work that Dick was working on finally got commercialized, and some of those resistant genes and germplasm are still out there in production today. This is germplasm featuring the glandular hairs. And stored product research, Larry had a program that it got going looking at stored pulses, had research breakthroughs on the roles of digestive proteases, developed a biomonitor for being able to monitor the movement of a larva inside a grain, and then got started on an international development project in the Cameroons, which is today the basis, largely the basis of the very successful PIX project, which some of you may have heard about, which is basically a triple bag storage system for storing cowpea grain. Also, it's a period where we made some advances in insect immune response to disease, and Professor Dunn is going to give us a presentation on the state of insect immunology at the end of the spring. So he was the one that did a lot of that early work, and as far as I know, the only member of our department who's been recognized with the College of Ag Research Award for his efforts. It was also a time we got involved in more quantitative ecology, working on corn rootworm, biocontrol, and toxicology. It certainly was the heyday of IPM, where we had specialists that were hired and stationed across the state to help carry out and implement the programs. We helped to develop an independent crop consultant association that's still active in the state today. Then we helped set up programs, diagnostic training center. There's a pest and PNPDL. Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab, thank you, and the National Pesticide Information Retrieval System, which is an insecticide label management system, and then winter meetings. All these things got set up in the 80s, so it was a time for huge growth. Also, the precursor to a lot of the outreach we do today got it started here with the Linnaean Games in the early 80s. Then we also had a catastrophe. We had a flood. They were building this building in 1980-81, and there was a drain pipe that was damaged, and it flooded the basement of what was then Entomology Hall. Well, we had moved the insect collection to the basement because it was too heavy to be on the first floor. And by the counts that I read, there were 2 feet of water in the basement that caused irreparable damage to a number of specimens. And we were able to basically get the contractor to set up an endowment for the department. I think it was about $200,000 that generates revenue today that helps go to support our activities in the museum. Some of the pests we worked on, Mexican bean beetles, Colorado potato beetle, spider mites were important during the 80s. And then the very first Distinguished Alum Award given in the department was given in 1988 and went to Max Summers, who's now a member of the National Academy of Sciences. In the 80s, it was a period of contraction. So we lost about 6 positions, and that's where it was somewhat offset by staff, professional staff that were put into place. During the 90s, it was a period of consolidation. Another change in leadership. We hired Jeff for genetics and then behavior, both Linda and we had Greg as a first had a faculty appointment, and then he didn't have a faculty. It was an instructor appointment, and then it was also a period where we were being recognized for outstanding teaching. I think both Tom and Al York were recognized at the university for their teaching efforts and beyond. And worked with the international aid programs. The CRISPs continued both in Africa and Latin America. And Bob O'Neill had a program down in Honduras in Zamorano, helping to promote development of sustainable pest management. And this was the year when the Purdue Mafia sort of controlled the leadership of ESA. Well, Chris became the 5th department head, came to us by way of North Dakota State University in Nebraska, where he got his degree. There he is working on sunflower pest management, but was already an excellent teacher and had been recognized for his teaching excellence even at NDSU. Some of the things that we were working on in the 90s, storage pests, ornamentals, beekeeping, regulatory issues continued to increase, so we added not only the pesticide label program, but then we had the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey, which is part of our program, and the databases that went with that. And we established 2 new centers that we still have in the department during that period. There's the Center for Regulatory Information Systems, which is the CIRIS group, and then there's a Center for Urban Pest Management, which is the Urban group. And it was a time when we had tremendous growth in outreach. So we added programs like insectaganza, the cricket spinning, and cockroach races, and so forth. And here's Rich Edwards sitting in a tub of water recording data while somebody is weighing corn roots, evidently staying cool in the process. Some of the pests that we had to deal with were Lyme disease, pine shoot beetle, Asian longhorn beetle, western corn rootworm variant. And we had a few hires, not many, we had a few during that period, a few retirements. And this is with the faculty at that time. And a couple of them there look like either CIA agents or race car drivers. I don't know what that's all about. Well, since I've been here, another change in leadership. We've added behavioral genetics, molecular biology and arthropod genomics, vector biology, landscape ecology, turf pest management, forest pest management, work on western corn rootworm in Europe, and then continue with the international development overseas. PICS project got going, and then our work in Afghanistan as well. And these are just the sort of signature areas that we work on as a department. We're not going to go through them in detail. They're on our website, but it really characterizes the work that we do today. Sort of field crops, pest management, urban forestry, soybean aphids, West Nile virus are all big parts of our activities this past decade. But we continue to show excellence in teaching, being recognized both at the university level and at the national level. We offered the all-time record number of courses, and that's been pared back in recent years, but a new minor was also introduced during that time. And I'm the 6th department head, Berkeley pedigree, with research interest in biocontrol and invasive species on international plant protection. And here I am with some of my friends and colleagues, is John Osmond and Dave Miller, one of our alums. You can see pretty big number of people added, almost as many that left, but we added a net +3 faculty during this time. And so where are we today? Well, we're going to hear about where we are today when we have other faculty and staff present about the department, but I just want to make a couple of conclusions about what I've observed the time I've been here and looking at the history of the departments. Entomology has been at the heart of the college's curriculum since day one, and that will continue going forward. And we're going to continue to serve this dual role, I see, as being an applied science focused on pest management, and also as a taxonomic discipline that contributes fundamental knowledge to basic life sciences. That's our DNA. That's who we are. And if you look at, there are a couple observations that just jump out at me. First is our dedication to students and to student success. We've had over 900 graduates come through this department, and these people have been tremendously successful. 61 of them have academic positions. We have 2 members of the National Academy of Sciences. We've had 6 distinguished alums, 22 Osmond Award winners, and that only scratches the surface. The second observation is that we're very responsive to change. And it's that ability to change that has made us relevant as time has marched on. And often new pests have brought these new opportunities. So if you take a look at research that we did on planting date and biological control, and that shifted to host plant resistance and chemical control, and then we worked on arsenicals, and that evolved into working on organophosphates and chlorinated hydrocarbons, and then looking at more selective and less persistent chemistries after that. We've been involved in working on efficacy trials, residue formulations, application technology, and all of this has been groundwork for our contributions to IPM, which is now fundamental to the way we practice pest management in this country. So it's not specific and exclusive to Indiana. Following World War II, we ventured into basic science, starting with pollination biology and systematics research, and got involved in insect toxicology, physiology, genetics, and now genomics all complement our research portfolio. Once we hired that very first extension specialist, we watched our capacity to help stakeholders grow since that time. And we've been able to meet every demand that has been made upon us as a discipline, as far as I can tell. And many of our programs have international components that have been difference makers, and we're going to hear about some of those as well. What are the most important contributions in the last 100 years? I think that's up for debate. For me, I want to put my money on 2 specific research accomplishments and 2 novel engagement initiatives. I think our contributions to host plant resistance, starting with the Hessian fly work on wheat in a long-lasting collaboration with USDA, is one of them. And another is the work that we've done on developing alfalfa weevil host plant resistance with glandular hairs. Those are my 2 picks for research accomplishments. And then in terms of special partnership with pest management industry, it's got to be clearly one of the unique things we do. Very few other departments have the kind of relationship we have with the pest management industry. It's not only provided us opportunities for hire, it accounts for about 40% of our graduate employment when they leave here. They may not all be working specifically in urban pest control, but they're involved in some aspect of pest management. It's also responsible for the fact that we have an endowed chair, and we'll soon we'll have an endowed professorship in that area. And last but not least, I think that our science education efforts with Early Roots and 4-H has been one of the most innovative insect outreach programs in the country for decades, and maybe there's an opportunity for an endowment in that area as well in the near future. So I'm sure that over time some of these features will change. What looks like today should be outstanding, it might change 5 years from now or 50 years from now looking back. But, and I'm sure we'll find more accomplishments to recognize. But I look at the history, as a roadmap to who we are today. And this centennial helps us to remind ourselves of this journey as we prepare for the next 100 years. Thank you.